Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahon. Masters 25 comes out soon, and as a result I'm doing a series of videos right now in the limited format. For now, we're looking at the best commons and uncommons in each color. I looked at white yesterday, and today we're doing blue. Let's get started with uncommons. I think the third best blue uncommon is Brine Elemental, a really fun card from a pretty funny standard deck back in the day called Pickles because of the Brine Elemental itself. The Elemental is pretty awesome. All morph creatures are usually playable in limited. Just if you haven't played a limited format with morph creatures before, they're basically all playable. This is because in the early game they're 3-mana 2/2s, which is nothing special, but there's still something in the early game, and then there's also something in the late game, basically all of them. And Brine Elemental is no exception. You can play it on turn 3 as a 2/2, have some board presence, and then in the latter part of the game, it can morph and you can make your opponent skip their untap step. It does cost 7 mana, which is a lot. It's a little clunky, but if you set it up correctly, it can be really backbreaking for your opponent. If you guys are sort of racing and you and your opponent are swinging back and forth and you use Brine Elemental, it can really hurt them. And it can also just really hurt them if they cast a big spell on the previous turn because none of their lands are going to untap. You'd have to wait for an opportune moment, so Brine Elemental isn't like a first pick, amazing, uncommon or anything, but I think it's one you'll play in most blue decks. The next best blue uncommon I think is Merlin Looter. I think this card seems really underwhelming to some people, but it turns out looting is actually really powerful. There isn't any madness in this set, but there are a few ways to reanimate creatures. There's a few payoffs for discarding cards, there's a few payoffs for drawing cards, and this does all of those things. Having the ability to loot is good because it lets you get deeper into your deck. It does something at all stages of the game as well, and not all 2-drops do that. Being able to just, have a better card quality than your opponent thanks to your Merfolk Looter is pretty great. And speaking of looting, our number 1 card can also do that, but it's basically Air Elemental that can loot, and that's amazing because Air Elemental is always a great card, and Murder of Crows is a strictly better Air Elemental. It's a 4/4 flyer, but when something dies, you get to loot, and that's really good. I think Murder of Crows and Merfolk Looter are both potentially first pickable. Neither of them are incredible. Blue's not as deep an uncommon as white was yesterday, but these are all 3 very good uncommons, and you'll take them in any blue deck you play. Now let's look at the commons. I think the third best blue common is another creature with morph, and that is Fathoms here. So, like I said, all creatures with morph are pretty good, and this one is very good. You can play it as a 3-mana 2/2 face down. You can also play it as a 2-mana 1/3, which I don't think you usually want to do, but you can do it if you're desperate. But what makes this really good is the fact that it draws you 2 cards for what is a total investment of 3 mana. That's a really good deal when it's attached to a creature. You can literally just play it and flip it. The thing is, you don't really want to flip it early because you need those islands in play, but in the late game, this turns into a pretty amazing source of card advantage. Your unassuming 2/2 suddenly flips into a creature that draws you 2 cards. Sure, it's only 1/3, but those 2 cards are great. You do have to return islands, and there's no landfall payoffs in this set. Would be kind of cool if they had those, but they're not here. But it's still worth it. Drawing those cards late is amazing. The second best blue common is Counterspell. If you know me and you followed my videos about limited for a while, you know I'm not normally very high on counterspells in limited formats. But that's because the vast majority of counterspells that are printed these days just aren't good. They're not hard counters, or they cost too much mana. Counterspell is a hard counter and it costs 2 mana. So the problem with a lot of counterspells is the opportunity cost. You have to leave up a bunch of mana and you have to hope your opponent plays into what you want to do. And not all counterspells can counter any spell, so if they don't cast the right kind of spell, you're in trouble. People can play around a lot of the counterspells that are in more recent limited sets. Playing around counterspell isn't as easy, and it actually gets a little better in a set full of morphs. If you have a face-down creature, your opponent will think even less of you having mana up because maybe you're going to morph a creature. But there's also instants. There's all sorts of stuff you can do by leaving mana up, and Counterspell can counter anything for only 2 mana. And that's pretty good. I think it's a first pickable common. You do have to be a pretty heavy island deck or you may not get to the mana for it, but it's good the whole game too, which is again not true of more recent counterspells that make it so your opponent can pay mana to get out of their spell being countered and so forth. I don't think it's the best common though. I think the best common is Mana War. I do love this card. I always love creatures that bounce other creatures, and this is the original one. And it's still one of the best ones because it does it for only 3 mana, giving you a 2/2 body to add to the board, and also bouncing usually whatever is your opponent's biggest creature, because if you do that, they're going to take a pretty big tempo hit because they have to pay that same amount of mana all over again. Worth noting, it does sort of have a corner case use as well as a way to bounce your creature who has pacifism on it. And there are several creatures with powerful Into the Battlefield abilities in this set, and it can help you trigger those as well. Usually you're going to want to bounce your opponent's creature, but I just wanted to make it clear that there is some additional value to be had with Mana War in addition to just bouncing your opponent's stuff, which is 99% of the time what you want to do. Well, that does it for my picks for the best blue commons and uncommons. Come back tomorrow for my video on the best red commons and uncommons for Masters 25 Limited. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to see more Masters 25 Limited content and limited content in general, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help my channel continue to improve, you can contribute on Patreon. There's a link in the description below. Thanks for watching.